So thank you all for joining this alumni connection. We are hoping to do more of this in the next. We already have a few more planned, connecting with alum circle from cohorts in the past. Just for I think all of you know what the WHT was, the Weidenfeld-Hoffmann Trust is, so I won't repeat that. And today we'll be speaking with Claudia Coleoni, who will present the work that she is currently doing at the Stockholm Environmental Institute, in particular at the Latin American Center, which is Water Beyond Boundaries. So we'll have a 10-minute presentation. I will ask a few questions following that, and then I will open the floor to everyone else in the call. So please go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you, Tammy, for the introduction. It's always very good to be part of the WHT alumni series. And then I just prepared one pager, if Tammy, if you could share it with us. The idea is just to talk through one of the projects that I'm currently working on at the Stockholm Environment Institute. And before I get to that, just a little bit of background. SCI Latin America was opened in 2018, and we're focused obviously on the Latin American region, but because we have many different centers across the globe, we're also very much international. So we were established in 1989 in Stockholm. There are two offices in the UK, actually. There's one in York, north of England, and there's one in Oxford as well. And our main mission is basically trying to bridge the gap between science, policy, and practice. And we're very much focused on environment and development, even from our historical origin back in 1989 in Stockholm. So one of the projects which is basically summarized in this one pager is the Water Beyond Boundaries. And we started this project this year, but we were already planning it throughout last year. And I think the title itself is very provocative and bold for what we are aiming. Basically, when we think of water management, water governance, or river basin management, we can say that we have a mentality that's bordered, and by that I mean we have administrative boundaries, we have political boundaries, social boundaries that are established in our society, but we're managing a borderless resource, which is water. And because water flows, that really changes the whole perception of the scale that we're working at. So scale really matters. And what we're trying to analyze here is how can we better represent water management, and how can we set up a new agenda? So for instance, especially for those who are going to join the MSc in Water Science Policy Management at Oxford, you'll probably hear about a very famous water governance approach or framework, which is the Integrated Water Resources Management, or IWRM, if we are to just using the acronym. And this is a very famous framework. It has been around for decades. And it is always trying to consider multiple water objectives, for instance, water supply, climate change. And it's trying basically to make a functional integration of land and water processes. But sometimes there are gaps in implementation. And this is true particularly in the global South. We have seen that in Latin America, we have seen that in Southeast Asia, for instance. And despite some of its gaps in implementation, and sometimes it's very sectorial based. It's also very well known for policy making. So it's not rare that you find watershed plans that take into account integrated water resources management, for instance. And it's even one of the SDG targets. It's the SDG target 6.5. So it's basically saying that by 2030, countries have to implement IWRM and whenever possible, focus on transboundary cooperation. I just gave the IWRM example, but we have many other frameworks. So for instance, we could think of water-related ecosystem services. We could think of water markets. We could think of river health and human rights to water, many other frameworks that are out there that have been used somehow throughout the globe, sometimes isolated, but most predominantly IWRM is used across different regions. So when we look here at this figure, what we're trying to say is basically recognizing that we have different scales. And when we talk about scale, we're talking about spatial scale, we're talking about time scale. We could think of other scales as well. We could think of economic factors, we could think of society in general, but these two components very typically reported in geography studies and everything are really guiding decision making, or perhaps decision makers try to guide themselves within these parameters. And then within those, watershed is typically the unit of management for water resources, not everywhere, but it's typically seen as a boundary that we can establish. And through that boundary, we will analyze the physical aspects, we will analyze the participation of actors. And this varies a lot from country to country. Some countries may have developed more participatory processes, so it may not necessarily be top-down, it might be more horizontal decision-making, but some other areas, because of probably competing uses, might have a more top-down approach. And still, participation is a very important requirement for decision-making in water, for instance. So taking that scale, we can also think of the country, we can also think of global interactions. And from the watershed perspective, you can also go to sectorial policies, for instance, hydroenergy, you can go through agriculture, water supply, sanitation, individuals. So for instance, the household would be a unit for that, especially when you're modeling water resources, but we can also think of the individual as a subject of rights and needs and decisions that can also be part of this process. And the time scale, so we can have analysis that are running at the hour, at the day, month, year, or decades. And with all of these scales, we have many interactions that sometimes are not necessarily well represented, particularly, as I mentioned, we have borderless water, but border thinking. So what we're really trying is going beyond those boundaries. And for that, we're looking at 3 pillars. The first one is the water teleconnections. So just a brief description of that. Sustainable water management should reach beyond the watershed. And with those participatory processes that I mentioned, so not only based on the place itself, but on the impact that you have. So teleconnections, for instance, if we think of an example of what that would be, it's something that it's not necessarily represented in your watershed plan or in your planning instruments, but really makes the difference locally. So we could give examples of climate change, for instance, that goes way beyond the boundary of the watershed. We could think of financial flows. So for instance, if we're exporting commodities there is a virtual water that's not necessarily quantified in those processes. And you're basically flowing across different scales. So there is flow of biomass, there is flow of energy, there are financial flows that are guiding these decisions. And sometimes those plans fail to recognize that influence that goes beyond the watershed. And one particular region might not be self-sustainable, but or if it is sustainable, it's relying on other regions to provide for itself, and that will cause an imbalance, for instance, in water management. So what we mean by water teleconnections are these connections that are not just based on the flow from the river basin and all of the components analyzed in that spatial unit. Another one very important as well is early ecosystem consideration. So this is about considering ecosystems in the very early process of planning. And this is important because there are processes that exist for ecosystem management or ecosystem services, but often they are considered when an impact has already occurred. And then you're trying to repair it, you're trying to mitigate it, but you fail to consider it at the early stage of planning. So if you do consider that as one of the pillars as we're proposing here, it might render you better results down the road. And then the third pillar is multi-interest, multi-scale participatory approaches. And this is basically recognizing that water is a collective, managing water is a collective effort. And from dynamics from upstream, downstream in the watershed, from recognizing common pool resources, which could be managed by a group of people, or we can think of more standard participation forms such as water councils, water agencies. No matter necessarily the approach, what we're trying to see here is that we recognize and that participation is a key process. But also we recognize that there are power imbalances across scales. So setting up a council or setting up an agency doesn't necessarily mean you have representativeness, right? Because there may be people in the water sector that might be established for longer. And in that sense, we also have a component which we call gender, social equity, and poverty, which is a program within SCI that also brings into the balance the gender aspect. And we've been running that, for instance, in Bolivia. But for this particular case study, or better yet, for this particular initiative, we're looking at 2 case studies. So we're looking in the Magdalena Basin in Colombia, and we're looking into the Mekong Basin in Southeast Asia. So at the same time that we are running, or better yet, we're understanding and studying these components, we're also trying to see it, how it works on the ground. And basically those 2 watersheds is where our institute has ongoing work. So with Colombia, for instance, we're working with the Ministry of Environment in Colombia, Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development. And they're looking at revising their planning strategies, their national plan for IWRM, basically. And then for the Mekong, we're still working on the partnerships, but we have established dialogues with the Mekong River Commission, for instance. So this goes hand in hand also with our purpose of developing this framework and trying to understand those connections on the ground. So Magdalena, of course, is within Colombia, and then the Mekong will be including other countries. So it's transboundary by nature. And then I think one interesting aspect of this is that we're always trying to understand what's the gap, right? And this is our current stage right now. But we also need to be attentive to what water managers are saying, what they're feeling. So what we hope is that by establishing this dialogue with these political institutions and organizations, we'll be able to test and validate what we're proposing. And across those pillars, we're also evaluating what are these forms of participation, for instance. So just to give you an example, in one of our studies in Colombia, we have seen an emerging trend, which is turning rivers into legal entities, for instance. So basically ensuring that the rivers have the right to be clean, the rivers have the right to protect their communities that rely on those rivers. And last year, the Magdalena River Basin was established as a legal entity. And I think it's still a bit unclear as to how far that will go. There are other river basins in Colombia that have had that legal status, for instance. But at the same time that it will address a need for more representation of communities and indigenous peoples, for instance, we're still, for instance, in the case of Colombia, we're still working within an IWRM framework. So how that dynamic will flow, how that will render us the results that we're expecting of more representation and to facilitate water governance processes. So I think this is just a summary and some provocative thoughts that we can discuss more. And just to give you an idea, this project is a 5-year effort. We're just in the first year. So it's also one process that we will evaluate as we go to see the role that water is playing and how we can better represent it and connect it, for instance, with poverty alleviation, gender and social equity. And so far, we are in the process of identifying those gaps and connecting with those decision makers that will provide us more information, help us validate what we have so far. So yeah, those are my initial considerations. And I know Hector is here, so if you want to jump in.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for the presentation. So we'll have time and space for everyone to ask questions and make comments. I have a few to begin. So you've mentioned the International Water Resource, or IWRM. Yeah, that's it. So can you talk more about what is the relationship that exists between the existing framework and the water beyond boundaries? Is it going to be, is the kind of like the ideal goal to be like to substitute the existing framework, or to like change parts of it to use this to create the next version of this framework? How it's happen?
I don't think we'll change it in a way, because as I mentioned in the beginning, it's very well established, and I think the idea is not to say it doesn't work. The idea is to say where it could work, but we're not limited, as I mentioned, to one water framework. Like IWRM is one out of many other frameworks. So I mentioned, for instance, virtual water markets, the right, human rights to water, and so on. But I started off with that example just because across the scales you have different challenges, and IWRM sometimes can be applied to those different contexts, but not necessarily will address those gaps that I was mentioning, for instance, participation and ecosystem consideration. So the idea, basically the conclusion will probably be So far there's no all-encompassing framework. But when you look at policies, they do really focus on it, right? So they do have a focus on the integrated water resources management, which has established dialogues across sectors and has made water maybe a more accessible, not necessarily accessible topic, but at least you have the structure in most places where the decision will be made. But still, I think it's very dominated by a couple of sectors, depending on where you're working. So economic sectors will probably have a say that's bigger than local communities, for instance. So is IWRM suitable for that, or should we take that and perhaps see it through a different lens? So I don't think we'll replace it. Also because it's already a policy, it's already under so many national policies. But just to highlight those gaps.
Okay.
And, yeah.
Thank you. My next question is still about, let's say, the framework or the way you are organizing this work. So you said that the outcome would be knowledge and tools to use this knowledge. But how is there already any consideration about how this knowledge will be distributed? What shape will that? How are you going to like train, inform, or educate people about your findings?
Yeah, this is a great question. Actually, I'll give you an example of the Colombia case, where we're working with the Ministry of Environment, and one of our components in that is capacity building as part of the process. So, for instance, in terms of the tools, SCI has a tool called Water Evaluation and Planning, WEEP, and that tool is used for hydrological modeling, for instance, and it has been used in many countries and different watersheds. So that's one example of a tool. Right now, for the water teleconnections pillar, we're also developing a tool that allows you to see the accumulated impacts of a determined action through the watershed. So that could be once the tool is applied for the case studies, we could also help spread that. But it's a very important point. I mean, we will produce knowledge, but if we don't have, as I was saying, a place where we're going to implement it and see how it works and see people's reaction, then it's kind of like theoretical, right? So we don't want it theoretical, and we're trying to establish that balance.
So on that note, so you mentioned that the two basins, the Mekong and Magdalena, you're working on were chosen partially because the institute already has working relationships in those places. But is there, beyond this, is there any other reason for choosing those particular two basins?
Yeah, so for instance, the Mekong, as I mentioned, is transboundary by nature, right? So it's one of the largest, the Mekong River is one of the largest rivers in the world and supports biodiversity, provides food security. And yeah, so basically thinking of the countries, right? It starts in China, it goes all the way to the Vietnam Delta, and then Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam. So it's, you know, it's very symbolic as well in terms of those relations that are taking place. And then the Magdalena, in terms of its importance as well for Colombia. Of course, it's not as large as the Mekong, and it's not transboundary in a way that it's, you know, flowing from one country to another, but it's about a quarter of Colombia's national territory, and then it makes up about 70% of Colombia's population, and it's also critical for resources, again, not just water, so food, biofuels, and electricity. And all of those relations are really dependent on the river itself. So that's why it's also very interesting to apply our framework and understand from those examples.
Thank you very much. So is there any question coming from the floor? I could keep, asking more, but maybe other people are interested. So so we have Maria, and then after Maria, Analia.
Yeah, it's there. So I have a question that's related to the last question, and it's about how was the response of the authorities or organizations when you came up with these projects, both in Colombia and in, well, I don't know how, if you already started with the project in Southeast Asia, and if you saw that there are like different responses in these both cases.
Good question. So as I mentioned, we were with the Institute, we have different centers that are involved in this initiative. So I wasn't involved, for instance, in the dialogues with the Mekong, but I was more involved with the dialogues in Colombia. And actually, to me, it was a very positive response, to be honest, because as I mentioned, my background is in water management, and I'm from Brazil, and I hadn't had that kind of discussion, for instance, here. And then in Colombia, I thought it was more open, but also because, as I mentioned, there are ties, like professional ties and personal ties to those people that, it came before the project was approved. So I think it was basically what I mean by that is you kind of construct and build the momentum, right? And then when you feel like there will be a better reception for that idea, maybe that's the moment that you try to partner with those institutes. And for Colombia, my feeling is it's really connected to their planning process, and it will be part of it, and we're trying to construct it in a way that it is. So I think it's a very tangible outcome in that way. I mean, we're addressing their needs first, right? What they have established as their priorities, but also they're open enough to hear from us and see how it can be shaped and how it can change. Now, from the Mekong perspective, from what I heard from colleagues, from the beginning, I think it was already more challenging just by the nature of the watershed itself. So just the fact that you're talking with different countries. Of course, you have the Mekong River Commission, but they do have their own interests. They do have their own budget agenda and all of that. And that can be challenging, but also an opportunity because they were receptive of the idea, but I don't think it will be apply everything at once. I think it will be a step by step. And it could vary from country to country. So maybe there will be a country in the Mekong that will accept more readily an idea, not accept, but we want to discuss with them, but they will accept this discussion, and perhaps others will not be so open. But so far, I think it's advancing with the partners. But as I mentioned, I'm more focused on Colombia. So, but yeah, great question. Thank you.
Analia?
Okay, so I have 3 questions. So the first question is, what is the final result of the project? It's only like a policy guidance, or will the project implement something yes, something for water access, or it's only for policy guidance?
Yeah, so I think we're not, as an institute, at the position to implement, right, an action necessarily. We won't be the ones implementing the policy, but we can guide that policy implementation more like an advisory role, and we can provide the tools for that, and perhaps the framework itself. So To answer your question, it really depends on how far we go for impacts, how far we go with our partnerships as well, and see how they will shape as well our process. And also there is an academic outcome, right? So when we develop tools and frameworks, that is already readily available and accessible. And then we won't have much control, right, of like who is actually taking that tool and implementing it. So maybe it will work as a benchmarking as well, and perhaps other cases will be interested. So besides the Magdalena Basin and the Mekong, we also have lots of work ongoing in California, which is a completely different context for water management. And we're running also some of those analysis in California. So I think it will really depend on how those partners will accept and implement. But ourselves, what we will do is develop these tools and this knowledge and make it available and see if it can be applied for, you know, beyond our case studies as well.
Okay. You mentioned also that you, at the moment, were identifying the gaps in the planning process of Colombia and in the Magdalena case. How do you identify those gaps? Like, what's the process?
So we have, as I mentioned, those three pillars, and they are our guides, basically our guideline. And what we'll try to do is analyze each one of those pillars. So initially, for the gaps, I mean, it's the typical process for instance, literature review, right? To see what's out there and see that we're not repeating ourselves in the literature of like the knowledge for water management as a whole and the existing instruments for that. And then for the Magdalena, we are revising the river basin plans that the Magdalena river basin has, the actions that they are planning long term. So we'll have that analysis like from the physical perspective, and that's already partially done. Also the economic instruments that are in place or that will be in place. But this, as I mentioned, within the framework of the national policy in Colombia, so the national policy for integrated water resources management. And we have their guidelines, but besides their guidelines, we're also doing this review of the literature. So I think it's a combination, right? It's a combination of the academic revision process and then the process itself, the political process, the instruments that are already in place in Colombia. And once you have that better identified, those gaps will be the ones that will focus more our attention. But so far, we're still identifying what those gaps are.
Yes, I asked you that because here in Colombia, we suffer a little bit of a lot of planning. So we have a national plan, then we have a municipal plan, then we have the department, the plan for the department, then we have a river basin plan. So I guess like those three pillars must be included in one of these plans, that the principal problem should be that there are too many plans that they don't speak to each other. So that's why I asked you. So,
and you're right. Just to comment on that, I mean, I think it's very clear when you start to look at that structure and you see that you have so many people doing so many things, and then what's the point that they will talk to each other? So yeah, I mean, one of the things we can, safely say is that the execution of the projects is really the point. I mean, you have a lot of, as you said, planning documents and lengthy documents, and yeah, sometimes the implementation is lacking in many aspects.
Okay, so one last question, I promise.
Okay.
When you said that, I read the other day that the Magdalena was now a legal entity. What does that imply? Because in here we have many constitutional like enforcement about what water access should be, and that differs a lot to reality. So what changes when you name a river basin a legal entity?
So you probably know that there are other examples for that. So it's the jurisprudence, right? So talking about the judiciary system and how laws will probably make an impact on that. So you have the Atrato River, the Cauca, and Tolima, Magdalena, Quindio. So basically, it's enforcing the rights of those communities. If you look at some of those examples, they suffer pressure from other economic sectors. So let's give an example: mining activities, or hydropower, for instance, is another pressing activity. Although you have those environmental policies in place and you have water resources management in place, not always you have the communities protected, or they may still feel they lack the resources they need for their livelihoods. And this legal representation is basically a push towards implementing your existing policies, right? So, for instance, like the Atrato River in Colombia, when it was considered a legal subject, was especially in response to indigenous concerns over water management. So if you have a framework that is really trying to encourage participation and deliver safe water for everyone, you're still living out communities that might not have a voice in those councils. And it's not that it's going to change regulation necessarily. I think it's the judiciary taking probably the lead. So the Tribunal Superior, right, taking the lead in some of the actions in Colombia, and it might help implementation, right? It might help achieve good health status for the rivers, for the activities that you rely on, so fishing, for example, and preserving biodiversity. I think it's an additional instrument that, you know, gives power and a bit of pressure in public administration.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you also, Analia, for the interesting questions. So I think there is a Tanvi next.
Yeah, thanks, Claudia, for that very interesting presentation. And I work a little bit with IWRM, and when I started this work, I was a bit surprised to learn that while the framework is kind of universally recognized, it's actually quite open to interpretation. So I really like your description of the 3 pillars that your sort of adaptation of the framework is based on, and how you've integrated the normative concerns of equity and ecological sustainability across different scales. So that is very interesting to know. I was just curious to see if this is something that you've done, which is, you know, while you've looked at water teleconnections and also participatory processes, I was curious to know whether you've been able to come up with, I don't know, a framework or a process to ensure participation from geographies that go beyond the immediate watershed. So, you know, participation from places that are linked through teleconnections, perhaps, but not part of the watershed that you're working in.
Yeah, no, awesome. Thank you. Thank you for the question. And yeah, about the definition of those pillars, indeed is based a lot on observations and results from previous research that when you combine, you realize those are missing gaps. So definitely wasn't, you know, just sitting one night and then, wow, that's cool, it's 3 pillars, you know. So it's definitely a construction of ongoing research. And some previous results in other case studies, as I mentioned, California, for instance, and even the Magdalena with some previous research. And then myself, about the participation component you were mentioning. I won't say it's an ideal example, but it's one of the examples that I can say of an existing instrument. So for instance, environmental impact assessments. I know when they are taking place, it's basically because there is a project that wants to be constructed and needs approval. That's what they want. And then they have the environmental policy saying, hey, stop for a while, evaluate what you're doing, see if there will be any impact where you want this activity to be taking place. So you can name many different infrastructure projects that need to go through that process. Although it's very limiting, it's one of the points in participation that you have to involve professionals from different areas. So it's not just water, it's the forest, it's the cities and different actors and stakeholders. And it will try to give you alternatives, right? So, okay, you have to do this, but how you mitigate, or can you adapt? So I think it's one of the instruments that already exist that tries to look beyond the region of impact of an activity, trying to look a little broader than that. But then it's also very complicated because it's often not necessarily talking with, so like the watershed plan, so it might not be an action that's already included there. But this example helps us illustrate that it is possible to establish those dialogues, to establish those connections, even beyond the area that you are implementing a project. And yeah, across, and then different aspects of that, not necessarily related to an existing or a project that wants to be built, is the idea of social ecological systems based on the framework from Eleanor Ostrom that studies governance at the community level, and basically ensuring that those common pool resources, which are resources used by everyone, may have a regulation that's agreed within communities. For instance, rural communities and irrigation issues that they may have, or water availability across the watershed. So there are different ways of organizing. It might not be this instrument that I mentioned, which is in many countries, it's part of the environmental regulation, but it can be also self-created. Maybe a community that has this organization power may do so and establish a group that will take the lead on that. And it exists. So those forms of participation may vary, but I think addressing the problem beyond where it is will help sustain those policies, whether locally or nationally.
Thank you. Please go ahead, Simant.
Yeah, so my question was very similar to what Tanvi asked. So Claudia already answered that. Thank you.
Okay, nice.
We still have 10 or 15 minutes. I'll ask a question. Given that there's actually 4, I think, prospective, like incoming students in the water science and policy, I'd like to ask Claudia, and maybe also Hector, to kind of like talk about how did you like end up at the Stockholm Environmental Institute?
Life is not linear, so it's a non-linear process. I think that's what we learned very quickly. It wasn't necessarily like I had a very clear idea that exactly where I wanted to work, but what I had a clear idea on is the region that I wanted to be working at. So Latin America was a region of interest, not just because I come from the region, but because I see lots of potential in terms of water management. And then I think it was during the, yeah, right through the end of the MSc, I applied for this position because at the Stockholm Environment Institute, because it would allow me to work in my region of interest in a topic that I liked, and also ensuring that I would have a global connection, as I mentioned, because there are many centers across the globe, and that would allow me to be part of, projects that are not just within one country, but also within countries of that are from different regions. And then, yes, I was also interested in environmental policy of like Scandinavian countries. I had this kind of like interest throughout the by the end of the master's, just to see how they implement. And then I thought it was a very good match, like it's the Stockholm Environmental Institute implementing projects in Latin America, and it was very new. So as I mentioned, like in 2018, so then I thought, you can kind of like be part of that culture and creating it. But yeah, I mean, I wasn't sure if I would be accepted at all. I mean, you never really know. So I just gave a go, and well, here I am.
Thank you. I wonder if we can get Hector. Are you there, Hector?
Yes, hi.
Yeah, just to kind of like talk about how you ended up at the Stockholm Institute and what you've been doing so far.
Yeah, thank you. So let me just turn my camera so you can see me, but I have several screens here. So just, okay. Hello. So yeah, I joined the Stockholm Environment Institute 3 years ago when they opened their office in Latin America. I mean, it was a very exciting thing to have this international institute opening an office for the region, in particular in Colombia, where I'm from. Because at that time, when the institution was actually looking for the best place they could find an office to have regional scope, they decided to be Colombia, because at that time Colombia was having an interesting leadership in the region about the implementation of the SDGs and even the creation of the agenda a few years before. So that kind of resonated within the Swedish government and the leadership of our institution, and they decided to go for Colombia. So it was a very exciting time, as I said. And well, I applied very enthusiastically to be part of the team. At that time, well, was just brand new office. It was like 3 people when I joined, and from then we have been a steady growth, basically by expanding on these ideas, such as the one that Claudia presented. So now we're a team of 15 researchers in Colombia that will, part of this bigger group of and again, it's a very interesting place to be at. SEI, among one of these ranks that are published globally about most influential think tanks. Actually, we are classified as the most influential in environmental, in environmental policy, etc. For things such as the carbon lock-in and other ideas that actually we develop as an institute. So yeah, it's very exciting to be part of this organization. We work much as an interface between science and policy. So I have a background as a scientist, mostly in water issues. So now having to shift into this position of moving the basic science into more applied into policy issues is actually quite an interesting intellectual challenge. Sometimes it's easier to be theoretical to be doing theoretical things than applied things. I think Analia made many questions regarding that, how difficult it is to go from theory to practice in the policy world. But that's what we do, and it's a very nice place to be. We're really happy to give you more to share with you more of what we do in if you would like to in the future.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm with happy to I can share your email with the participants of this call so that they can contact you. direct.
Sure.
Okay, perfect.
Yes, of course. I'll write it here in the chat.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So, perfect. Is there any other last minute question? One last opportunity? Otherwise, we'll move to close this session. Okay, then Aaron, maybe? Is that a question? Or?
It's just a comment. I don't know if you can take me clearly.
Yes, just about.
Okay, yes. Just trying to wonder whether we're going to have this kind of lecture series so often, because it's really something very interesting and just like bringing theory and knowledge into practice.
Yes. Can you mute yourself? Okay, thank you. Yes, so I started this summer to organize this series because I realized that we have almost 300 alums in the WHT core or network, and most of them are doing very interesting things like Claudia is doing. And I thought, okay, so why not contact each and every one of them to come and just talk about what they're doing, and what they're doing is more often than not it's at the forefront of research or enterprise in all corners of the world. So we will do more. There's already 2 organized for the next. I mean, there's already 1 organized, I think, for the next 4 weeks. So next Tuesday, we are going to go to Vietnam and talk about coffee with an alum who recently started a coffee business. The week after that, we'll go to Namibia with talking about conservation in the natural reserves and so on and so forth. So for the foreseeable future, we'll have this. If you don't get tired of Zoom, you will have this opportunity. So thank you all for coming today. I hope that you go away and tell all your friends that how great this was, so that they should attend next time. And thank you, Claudia, for preparing this presentation and for giving us the time. Thank you also, Hector, for answering our questions and being available to get in touch with our scholars. So thank you all again, and I'll see you on Tuesday.